June 15th, so you can order it now, and we can share the link for that book in our chat section. And Carolyn is also the member of the James Beard Book Awards Committee. She's a true expert on Chinese food. We are so thrilled to have her. So, and she is going to talk to us today about the Chinese wok. So Carolyn, why don't you come onto the stage, turn on your camera, and welcome, Carolyn. So happy to have you here.
I did. Hi.
Great to have you. So Carolyn, let's start. Tell us about the wok. What is its history and why is it so cool?
It seems to be a relatively new cooking utensil in China. New in Chinese terms, of course, is different from us in the West. This was about 2,000 years ago, the Han Dynasty.
And you consider that new?
For China, yeah, it's got at least 5,000 to 8,000 years of history. So.
Okay.
With America, we've got 250 years and we think it's a big deal, but no, for them, this is relatively new.
Right.
So you have the wok here. This started probably around the Han Dynasty. The reason for that is mainly material. Before that, it was China had bronze. It was the Bronze Age in China, and iron gradually, of course, evolved into steel, and only later on was it allowed to go out into the general populace and be used for things like woks instead of swords and shields.
So, okay, so Carolyn, you lived in Taiwan for several decades and started using the wok intensively, I think, for the first time when you arrived in Taiwan. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you learned about China through your wok and through learning to cook.
Sure. Actually, the first time I used a wok was in my mom's kitchen. I was in high school. My best friend, was Japanese American, gave me a wok, and I used it on my mom's electric stove, and I couldn't get the heat up high enough, of course.
That's not good.
And so I put foil around the base to increase the heat. I think that was a brilliant idea. And so, of course, I blew out the stove. Mom got me a West Bend electric wok, which was not much better. I still have it though. It's great for steaming. Yeah, it wasn't really until I went to Taiwan that I learned how to use the wok, because the mom in my host family was a fabulous Taiwanese cook. And she cooked every night, and it was basically stir fries, as well as pan fried fish. She loved that. She was just an excellent cook, and I would just hover over her. That was my favorite part of the day.
Mm-hmm. And were you there as a student, you said, with your host family?
Yes, I went there as a student. I was there for the first 2 years as a student, and then stayed on a little bit longer. I was working as an editor and a translator. Of course, a very bad translator, but at least an English editor. And then I met my soon-to-be husband.
Mm-hmm. And so tell us a little bit about him. I understand that he basically was desperate to have you cook more Chinese food. So you learned a lot about China, right? And about Chinese traditions through the process of working with these cookbooks and cooking with your wok, right?
Most definitely. The thing is, as anybody who's tried to learn Chinese knows, it's a very, very difficult language. It's probably one of the most difficult in the world. And I was just at a plateau. I could not learn anymore. I mean, I'd learn a word and go out my brain the next minute. But one thing I could understand was the food. And my husband, my then boyfriend, started buying me cookbooks because he really wanted me to cook Chinese food. I mean, he's a good cook, but he's also very slow. It drives me absolutely insane. So I like to cook French food and then American food. And he was like, yeah, that's fine, but what I really want is this. And so he was buying me cookbooks, and that's where I started to learn. He showed me some things in the kitchen, but it was basically, here you go. That's when I really had to learn, because it was like, sink or swim.
And these were cookbooks that were all text in Chinese.
Right, the old-fashioned Chinese style, he would get them. He loves used bookstores, and so he would buy these little paperbacks that were printed maybe in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and just were crumbly and crummy. But they were printed in lead type, in vertical, old-fashioned traditional characters, rather muddy, no explanations. And I would be going through, oh, what are we cooking today? Okay, and so what does that mean? And so that was really, really helpful because I was learning, and then it was repeating. I was doing, oh, okay, that's what this character means. That's what this technique is. And I started to learn,
Right.
as I
And
went.
to this day, is your kind of cooking vocabulary better than the rest of your Chinese? I mean, is it your best Chinese is related to cooking? And
Probably at the beginning it was, but then later on I became a interpreter at the National Museum of History and the National Central Library. And then when we returned to the United States, I became a court interpreter for the federal and state courts. And so that really, if you really want to learn
yeah.
Chinese or any other language, work in the courts where it's intensive. It's very intensive.
All right. So you had some pretty, speaking of intense, you had some pretty intense experiences with your in-laws relating to food and your walk. So first, tell us quickly, who were your in-laws? What was their story in mainland China before they came to Taiwan? It's pretty fascinating.
Sure. My father-in-law was a World War II fighter pilot for the Nationalists. He fought against the Japanese, not the communists. He wasn't in the Civil War. And he was basically stationed in southern China, south in Sichuan and Kunming. And his father he was Hakka. He was from the northern hill country of Guangdong. And his father was a mayor in the area, a governor of that particular area.
So a high
Um,
profile family.
yeah, and he was, he graduated from law school, and his own father graduated from law school. And my father-in-law ran away to join the Air Force when the Japanese invaded China. And it was very upsetting to his family because they had his life all planned out for him. They had a girl he was going to marry, and he was going to take his father's seat, and so on and so forth. But that sort of caused a huge split between them. But he was following his dream, and he loved his country, and so he became a hero during World War II. He actually saved his company during one foray, and as a reward was allowed to attend the Japanese surrender in Nanjing.
Amazing. And you were saying, just to quickly run through this, you were saying that he was shot down, and so what happened then? He
Well, what happened was that his company had just completed a foray against the Japanese, and they were very low on gas, on fuel, and he had to get them back to their the Air Force station there. And so he made sure everybody was safe, but he was running on fumes. And it was almost sunset, and he saw a flat area ahead. So he started to land. And just as he began to land, he realized it wasn't land, it was the tops of this ancient forest. And so his plane just tumbled through the branches. Luckily, the engine went in one direction, he went in the other, but he was just beaten up by the branches as he went down. He had his face peeled back from his skull. He lost his front teeth, broken ribs. He was just totally busted. But he was rescued by the Air Force and airlifted over to Karachi, where there was a American MASH set up there, and they put him back together, and he looked perfectly good. I mean, he loved Americans after that because they just restored his
so
good
he
looks.
survived, and amazingly, you then had some interesting experiences cooking with your father-in-law. Tell us a little bit about what you learned from him.
Well, we cooked together because both of us were the quieter members of the family. We didn't like to get into arguments, or we had no dogs in those fights. So we would hide in the kitchen, and he would teach me things, especially for Chinese New Year when we had the big family get-togethers. He would make his specialties like the stuffed tofu, nyang tofu, or his famous vinegar chicken, which was just fabulous, and steamed fish. He had this huge banquet that he would prepare for the family, and it was in this tiny kitchenette in this senior's apartment in downtown Chinatown in LA. And we would hide in there and just cook all day. And it was just wonderful to watch him carefully do everything. He was a very, very precise man. And and oops, I would just lean over his shoulder and just watch him. And then pretty soon I was picking up what he was doing.
And you said, forgive me for the dog in the background, I'm sorry, but you
That's all
said
right.
you also learned a lot about traditional Chinese culture by spending time with him. There were certain ways in which it was
Right. My as soon as my father-in-law, at that time he was just my boyfriend's father, I realized that I wasn't going anywhere. He treated me as his number one daughter-in-law. But the thing is that comes with a price, because in Chinese culture, especially traditional Chinese culture, I couldn't look him in the eye anymore. We had to keep a certain distance between each other. I had to show respect. You know, it was a little bit of a learning curve for me, because I was, I'm feminist, right? And so I had to be a submissive daughter-in-law, but it kept the wheels going in the family, so it was like, yeah, okay, suck it up and do it. But it was great, because I was then treated as the daughter-in-law. I had assumed the position. I understood the game, and so got along really well. I mean, we really liked each other.
yeah, fascinating. And there was a breakthrough moment through cooking, again, with your mother-in-law around food. So talk about that.
Well, she was a very different person. She was from Tianjin in northern China, which is a seaport for Beijing. And her father was a warlord's lieutenant. So she actually grew up in a very, very wealthy family. She had her own chauffeur and nanny when she was a child of 3 years old. Um, she was just a little princess, but the problem was that her mother uh, didn't bear sons. So her, excuse me, her father just left them, just abandoned them, and went off and got somebody else, and finally had a son with him. He was actually assassinated during an insurrection. But before that, he had his concubine, or his wife, hold the baby boy up on a horse while his troops paraded back and forth in front of him. I mean, just that kind of a life. It's just so foreign to us.
Yep. So she
But
eventually fled, and she was a challenging person.
she was imperious, and it was like dealing with the Dowager Empress. Uh,
Okay, so
uh,
what was the moment? What was the moment with you got your walk and you're cooking? What was the moment, the breakthrough moment?
we had a crummy little apartment, my boyfriend and I, in Long Beach, and we invited her over for an afternoon, because we really wanted to get to know her, get her to know me. So my boyfriend and I had bought a lot of these cookbooks in downtown LA, Chinatown, and I had learned how to cook northern foods. The one that really my husband was really intent on me learning was something called chestnut thimbles, these water. And so you had to soak these dried chestnuts and peel them and pound them into a paste, and then make them into a dough, and then form them into thimbles and steam them. Um, and so we had her over, and she was sitting at the kitchen table, and she was doing her usual scowl at me, and I could barely speak. I was terrified. I had fantasies that we would get along just like, peas and carrots, but it was not going to happen, right? So she started to smell the leaves of water, and her eyes started to sparkle, and she kept on looking at the stove. And I brought the steamer over, put it on the table, opened it up, and this warm, breath of chestnuts just came over her, and her eyes just sparkled. And she reached out and took a bite with her chopsticks, and you could just see her kind of like melt. The shoulders just kind of relaxed. And it was something that she hadn't had for a very long time. And I said, when's the last time you had those? And she said, at my mother's home back in Tianjin, which would have been before the war, I mean, when she was still a young girl. So it
Yes.
was at least 40 years. And
So
that was
interesting
the
that
ice
idea
melter.
that food is connected to, connects us to memories.
Absolutely.
Like you
It,
said,
it
in
opened
that
her up.
moment, the stories started tumbling out about her history.
Absolutely. And that was the first time, actually, probably the only time she really talked about herself, because she was really closed mouth about herself. We didn't even know what year she was born in. All we knew was that she was born on the sixth day of the 12th lunar month. But her belief was that if the gods didn't know when she was how old she was, then they wouldn't come to collect her, you know? So,
So what's fascinating to me, I know you said that, you know, you would refer to her and your father-in-law as Nin, right? And that
mhm,
it was very traditional culture
right.
manifested through them.
Yeah,
Um,
we had to
it-
call them thou.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Right, exactly. So, you know, that culture kind of doesn't exist anymore.
no.
Um, but why are you grateful that you know about it and you learned about it? That traditional culture and the values, et cetera. Why is that still important today?
I think China is really all about its culture. I mean, its language, you have 200 at least dialects in the country. You have histories that are different in each province and in each region, but the culture is so marvelous. It's like one of the greatest and it actually the longest lasting culture in the world. It's provided us with the greatest thinkers during the pre-Han dynasty, the pre-Qin dynasty, and we really need to connect that because if we lose it, it's gone forever, and it's a treasure. And
Mm,
so, what I loved about being in hindsight, I mean, going through it was not you know, a happy experience, but looking back on my life with my in-laws and watching their and hearing their stories, I understood that actually their lives were microcosms of modern Chinese history. And it was this really important period where very traditional China that had existed for thousands of years suddenly had this dramatic rift and became part of what we would call the modern world. And so seeing how their lives changed and evolved, how it hurt them in many ways, because they were broken off from all their roots. They were just uprooted from their families. My mother-in-law escaped from the Japanese with a bunch of other schoolgirls and took a ship down to Yunnan. I mean, and then walked about 200 miles. I mean, can you imagine?
yep.
But they really never had any life and connection with their families again. It was all gone. But in at the same time, they were thrust into the modern world and into the Western world. And so it was fascinating to see all of this actually happen and unfold before my eyes.
Right. And what's so fascinating is in today's China, people are kind of longing for their roots and looking back to roots and looking back to history, right?
Absolutely. I've spoken to people in Taiwan and in mainland China and here in the United States and Canada who are ethnic Chinese, and they're fascinated by their roots, and they should be. They feel a disconnection uh, that really is something that's part of them. And the more they learn, I mean, part of it is cooking, learning to cook the foods of their grandparents. I have people
Right.
that write to me and say, do you know how to make this? I had one woman in Sacramento wrote me a letter, said, my grandmother died recently and she made these cookies. She was from this city or this actually this village in Guangdong. And she left when she was a little girl, but she made these lard cookies. And so could you find out a recipe for them?
Oh
And
my
something
goodness.
like that, it's just like, it just thrills me because number one, I get to learn something new. I get to find something and it's like a detective work. And then, you know, give them the recipe, find out whether it's something that's actually accurate,
Yeah.
and then find out, does that bring them joy? Because it usually does. It's just a
Right.
connection with grandma,
Oh my
and
gosh,
then
that
they
is
can
so
give them to their
beautiful.
children.
Carolyn, thank you so much. That is just amazing. I mean, my God, from the walk to World War II, to traditional Chinese culture, to connecting food, to how food connects us to memories and brings us joy. We are so grateful to have you with us today. Thank you. Thank you. And everybody who's tuning in, I just want to remind you that we've got this wonderful series of programs in the next several weeks. It's the Food and Ideas Festival, which Carolyn helped us kick off on our first one, and we're delighted that she's in the kickoff event for this year's Food and Ideas Festival. So please tune in and come back again. Thank you so much for
All right.
helping us tell the story of China, Carolyn.
My pleasure. And then gratuitous product placement.
Please, absolutely read the book. It's called At the Chinese Table, and you've got to read it. Thanks so much, Carolyn.
Thank you all.
Take
Take good
care.
care. Bye.